Hello everybody, and welcome to what is the second in our talks about Reading Abbey. And this one we've titled the Royal Abbey of Reading, and we'll explain what that means. And just to remind you, this is also in a series in the run-up to the 900th anniversary of the founding of Reading Abbey. This time I'm delighted to welcome our new speaker. It's John Painter. Welcome, John. I think John is pretty well known to members of Friends of Reading Abbey. For those that don't know him, John spent about 36 years working for Reading Borough Council, and nobody's quite sure what he actually did during that time. He's a keen singer, and he's also chairman of the Reading Male Voice Choir. And probably most relevant for our purposes here today, John's been an active member of Fora for the last 9 years. And 2 years ago, he collaborated with Peter Durrant and produced a very readable book called The Reading Abbey and the Reading Abbey Quarter, which I think John's now showing us. I think a few copies might be left for purchase. So, the Royal Abbey of Reading. We have in fact with us a copy of the 1901 book by J.B. Hurry. And in his book, Hurry said, well, here's John again showing the picture of the book. There's a statement which says, the long series of national events which the Abbey has witnessed claim for it a permanent place in our national history. Few religious houses have been so favoured by the sovereign or selected by so many parliaments of the realm, royal marriages or funerals, or great secular and ecclesiastical councils. So that's quite a claim, and he makes a strong point there. Reading was unusual, Reading was a royal abbey. What we want to explore today is what does that really mean, and was indeed Reading very different from all the other abbeys in the country? So John, if we start off and just really explore that idea, a royal abbey, what does it mean to you?
Well, it's an interesting concept, and Reading was clearly founded by the king, and he had a specific reason for founding Reading Abbey, which was for the salvation of his soul, and also the souls of his dead parents, William the Conqueror and Matilda, his dead brother, William Rufus, his dead wife, Matilda, and also his dead son, William Atheling, who had died only a few months before, in 1120, in the wreck of the White Ship. And the timing of the foundation of Reading Abbey is possibly quite interesting in relation to that. But Henry founded it as a royal abbey. He intended to use it as a royal abbey, and he founded it in very lavish terms. It was a very large abbey. It was designed and built in Romanesque architecture, Norman architecture, to a very high standard, and it was richly endowed by the king and others with lands and other things. And most importantly, I think, in terms of the abbey's impact in the Middle Ages, he gave to it one of the most important relics in England at the time, the hand of St. James. Henry intended to stay at the abbey and did so, and successor kings did so as well, and Henry also was buried at the abbey in 1136, following his death in Normandy in 1135.
Okay, so immediately we have this strong association with the king, and quite an important point which you mentioned, which was the king's son William, who obviously he expected to have succeeded him, drowned. He therefore didn't have a male successor, he had his daughter. I presume that was a pretty devastating thing for the king then. Was there an expectation that Matilda would indeed inherit and become one of the first queens of the country?
Well, there was, although we shouldn't forget that Henry had in fact remarried the year before his the foundation, Adelisa of Louvain, who was something like 30 years younger than him and was described as nubile, so he might have had expectations of having more children. And indeed, Henry, according to the Guinness Book of Records, is the King of England who has had most children, although the majority of them were illegitimate.
Right.
Interestingly, Henry had no more children, and Adelisa had no children with Henry, although after his death she married and then had a number of children. So
right.
She was fertile. He appears not to have been fertile at this point.
Okay, that's significant, isn't it? So we know, sadly, that for him, he founded the abbey in 1121, and then really quite quickly, so it was roughly, we know parts of the church were complete around about 1125, and then only, 10, 11 years later, it was actually needed for his burial. What do we actually know about his death and burial?
Well, he died He died in Rouen. He died near Rouen, in fact, in Normandy. He was hunting in the area. There were issues about security in Normandy, which is why he was there. He died in a place called Lyon-le-Forêt, following what is called in the records a surfeit of lampreys. He overate,
yes.
in other words. As lampreys are little eels, and died a few days later. What is interesting about his death is that the Archbishop of Rouen was with him when he died. The Archbishop of Rouen, Hugh of Amiens, was in fact the first abbot of Reading Abbey, and he moved from Reading Abbey to become Archbishop of Rouen. So there was a connection at his deathbed between Reading Abbey and the king. It was on his deathbed that Henry said he wanted to be buried at Reading Abbey, and he was taken to Reading Abbey, which took something like 5 weeks because there were clearly problems in the channel. He had to be taken over to Reading by sea. That happened from Cllr. The winds were against the ship, and it wasn't until Christmas that the ship could sail, and he didn't get to England until January, and was buried in Reading Abbey on the 5th of January 1136. There are some very interesting stories about the process of eviscerating his body. His heart and intestines were taken out and they were buried in Rouen. His brains were taken out, and the man who took out his brains experienced such a great stench and putrefaction that he in fact died from it. So this man is normally regarded as Henry's last victim. And the body was sewn up in a ox's hide, and then started leaking. Black liquid came out of it, so it's all a very unpleasant
you always get more
process.
Detail than you expect with John Painter, I guess.
But eventually he ended up in Reading Abbey, and was buried in front of the high altar, which means to the west of the high altar. So therefore the high altar must have been in place, and we can take it from this that the chancel had been built and was in use, and the body was buried to the west of the high altar. That's quite important in terms of locating where his body was buried, in fact, which is an issue that is of contemporary interest.
Absolutely, when you're aware of that one. Okay, so we're now into the sort of the 1130s, and then of course we have the problem that Matilda initially becomes queen, but that's obviously contested by the barons, and we have this dreadful period called the Anarchy, effectively the First Civil War. What do we know happened in Reading and happened to the Abbey during that sort of period of the Anarchy before the succession of the next king, Henry II?
Yep. I mean, what happened in practice at Henry's death in Normandy? The throne was claimed by his nephew Stephen of Blois, who moved very quickly to come to England and claim the throne. The barons accepted him, the citizens of London accepted him, which is perhaps the most important, and he was crowned just before Christmas in 1135. So at the time of Henry's funeral, Stephen was the crowned king and was present at the funeral. Matilda didn't come to England. Matilda was heavily pregnant at the time. Right. That's one reason why she didn't come to England. So Stephen succeeded Henry as king, and Matilda didn't pursue her claim to the throne actively until about 1140. In fact, it was pursued for her by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester. And the Anarchy, as you say, was a civil war, which interestingly seems to have passed Reading by. So as far as the Abbey was concerned, building continued, building of the church in practice, but not very much happened in Reading. Stephen came to Reading in 1140, passing through on his way to Wallingford. Stephen was then captured in 1141 at the Battle of Lincoln and held at Wallingford Castle. And Matilda came to Reading in state in 1141 and was well received and issued a number of charters. Right. But that in practice is it. I think one of the reasons why Reading escaped the worst of the Anarchy was because Wallingford Castle was held for Matilda by a chap called Brian Fitzcount, who was loyal all the way through the process and a strong person. Yes. And Stephen couldn't take Wallingford Castle.
And that's quite interesting because we were aware of the Treaty of Wallingford, the first sort of peace treaty between the two sides, and I think that then was superseded by the Treaty of Windsor. So there clearly was a lot of movement through the Thames Valley, but somehow Reading seemed to be sort of left alone and wasn't too badly affected as far as we're aware.
Indeed. No, well, Windsor and Wallingford were the two castles in Berkshire. They were the two main fortresses, and they were the key points that of control of the county.
Okay, so that very much sort of explores the early stages of the abbey, and it's sort of this set up as a royal, or not just a royal abbey, but also a royal mausoleum, which is important, obviously, for the first king's burial here. And then, if we're exploring this idea of royal abbey, can we say were other abbeys royal in the same way, had a connection closely with the king?
There were lots of abbeys that were owned by the king, and that number increased, in fact, over time as the king took lands from other people. And of course, at the time of the conquest, there were lots of Saxon monasteries that had been founded by Saxon kings that fell into the hands of the crown. I think what makes Reading of interest is that while it was a royal abbey, it was an abbey that the king and the court came to regularly. And the reason why they came to Reading regularly is summarised really by a chap called William of Malmesbury, who was one of the writers at the town, who said, "Henry I built this monastery between the rivers Kennet and Thames, in a spot calculated for the reception of almost all who might have occasion to travel to the more populous cities of England." So it was between London and Westminster and Windsor, and places where the king might want to go from those places: Winchester, Salisbury, Oxford, and Gloucester as well. What you did was you came down the river from Windsor to Reading. It was a day's trip. You got off at Reading, you stayed at Reading, and then off you went in different directions. And really, the importance of Reading in the 12th century is very much, the logistical importance is very much the same as the logistical importance nowadays. The same reason why Network Rail have just invested nearly £1 billion in Reading Station. It's a major interchange now, it was a major interchange then, and it was a place where the king came to.
Yes,
and I think the interesting thing is not why the king came to Reading. I think the more interesting question is why the king did not have a palace or a castle in Reading, and the answer to that is he stayed at Reading Abbey.
So when we say he stayed at Reading Abbey, he would have, one guesses, stayed at the abbot's house. Where would he actually physically? Do you have any ideas about this?
No, well, it's a very interesting question, and there's no particular reference to what happened. But common sense suggests that the abbot was kicked out. And,
right, he had to go and find lodging else.
The king moved into his accommodation.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons I think why Reading Abbey was built on such a grand scale was it was always intended to accommodate the court and all the people that will be travelling with Henry. Now, there are two references to the size of the abbey. One is that it was founded for 100 monks. The other is that it was founded for 200 monks. 100 is more likely, but that's a large building. And if you look when you're in the abbey ruins at the size of the dormitory, for example, you can get a sense of just how large it is.
Yes, yes.
Now, I think you've got to see that as a place where, in due course, when the court and council came to Reading, that's where a number of people basically will be bunking down. So
it wasn't just the abbot that was thrown out, but all the monks had to go and find somewhere as well, probably, when they alighted.
Where they went, who knows? But one assumes also that these royal stays in Reading, and they happen quite frequently, contributed enormously to the local economy.
Yeah. Yeah, because they'd been anticipated, they'd have known they were coming, a whole variety of fares and also, all the ancillary services that came with it. I can obviously see that. Okay, so then we have quite an extended period during the abbey's life, its heyday, when it was obviously a major ecclesiastical, say, religious, a royal institution. And we've got quite a list of major events. Do you want to perhaps take us through some of those and what the significance were?
We're sitting in front of one of them. The abbey was completed and sanctified by Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1164, in the presence of the king. Before that, in fact, in 1163, there was an interesting event that happened in Reading, a trial by combat between Hugh of Essex and Robert de Montfort, which happened on Fry's Island. I'm mentioning these because within Reading Museum, which is where we're sitting, there are wonderful paintings of a number of these events. We're in fact sitting in front of another of them. This is the if you like, the state visit of the Patriarch Heracles of Jerusalem in 1185, who came to England to petition King Henry II, who you can see in the picture, to become King of Jerusalem, to join the crusade and become King of Jerusalem. And Henry received him with his bishops and church advisors, and had a serious discussion with him and with them as well, and concluded in the end that it wouldn't be a good idea for him to go on crusade and become King of Jerusalem. and he sent him away. We didn't send him away. He escorted him from the country to France, where he then met with the King of France and Heracles, and the King of France said the same.
Tried him instead.
Indeed. But
was he eventually successful? Did he find out he wasn't?
No. But although of course Henry's son Richard I did go on crusade, on the next crusade, so who knows? Perhaps there was a legacy.
Yes.
There. But this is an example of a state visit. The year before, as a matter of interest, King Henry had received his son-in-law, the Duke of Saxony, at Reading Abbey as well. So a tradition started of Reading Abbey being used to host major events.
Right.
And there were a number of others, and in the pictures in the museum you can see them.
Yeah. What I just want to mention, 1219. What happened then?
Well, in 1219, and there's not a picture of this in the collection. William Marshal, the great William Marshal, who had in practice become regent of England in 1216 when King John died and Henry III, aged 9, became king, and had also been instrumental in driving out the heir to the throne of France, Louis, who had occupied quite a lot of England, including Windsor Castle he held. William Marshal died at Caversham. William Marshal held a large number of lands, but he was Lord of the Manor of Caversham. He died at his manor in Caversham, which is most probably in the area of Dean's Farm in Lower Caversham.
Yeah.
And his body was brought across the river to Reading and was then taken up to London, where he was buried in the Temple Church.
I was keen to mention that because only last year we unveiled a plaque, I think sponsored by Cllr, on Caversham Bridge, really sort of celebrating, commemorating the life of William Marshal. And again, we have sort of that connection between the Caversham side, the bridge, and here, which is important.
Yes.
Okay, so that's 1219. Then there are 2 or 3, I think, royal weddings here.
Well, yes. Before we get to the royal weddings, but both King John and his son Henry III were very active visitors to Reading. Henry III in particular, he came to Reading lots of times. He came almost every year. He stayed in Reading for important church events, for Christmas, for Easter, for Whitsun. These were events where he wore his crown. And when I say the king came to Reading, I mean the king and his court and council came to Reading. That's where the king was active. That's where he was making his decisions. And Henry was... Reading is the place that... the kings of England were very itinerant, and they went to lots and lots of different places. But Reading was the 6th most popular place that Henry III stayed. Mm-hmm. So after Westminster and Windsor and so on. And he was a regular visitor to Reading. And that's in part because he was travelling from Windsor westwards. Yeah. And he stayed in Reading on his way to wherever he was going.
Yeah. So again, we've got this very significant connection, which is begging a question which I'll come to in a minute. But let's go on with one or two of these more significant sort of royal events.
The royal weddings. The royal weddings happened in the reign of Edward III, who was Henry III's great-grandson, and he was the king who started the 100 Years' War, so they were about 100 years later. And Edward III is interesting because on 2 occasions when he went to France, he established a council of regency under one of his young sons in Reading. So he did this twice. And essentially the government of England was based in Reading for periods of time while he was away in France.
And that carried on, actually. Obviously we know during the medieval period, but right up through into the Tudor period, which we'll perhaps pick up a bit later, but certainly that we get this sense that there's this strong royal connection, and it makes it a very significant town in the south of England. Comparable to, say, Winchester or Salisbury, or how relatively, how can we compare them?
But certainly Salisbury, I think, is a good comparison, because the king was regularly going to his hunting lodge at Clarendon. Winchester possibly was more important, or certainly at the beginning of the process, because Winchester was the sort of unofficial second capital of England in the early medieval period, and the treasury was there for a period of time. Right. So therefore Winchester was an important place for the king to go to.
Yes, okay. So the question I have then is, if we have this significant royal connection, we have weddings here, we have the royal visitors, and yet Henry I seems to be the only monarch that was actually buried here. And he set up as a royal mausoleum, presumably anticipated that future kings might be buried here, and yet he was the only one. So how do we explain that?
Well, it's interesting. Henry was buried here. His second wife, Queen Adalisa, may have been buried here, but there are different records of where she was buried, but there is a conventional view that she was buried in Reading, and there is a record saying that she was buried on the north side of his tomb. She wasn't buried with Henry because she'd married again.
Ah, yes, yes.
And in 1163, I believe, or 1153 in fact, his young great-grandson, William of Poitiers, who was the eldest son of Henry II, was buried at his feet, which means between Henry's tomb and the high altar, because he had died at the age of 2.5, I think, at Wallingford. So it was a child burial.
Yeah.
He died nearby and was buried at Reading, I guess, because Reading was a reasonably near abbey.
Yeah, there's no big abbey at Wallingford.
Well,
I suppose Dorchester perhaps, but yes.
But so that happened. But I think the reason why Reading didn't develop as the royal mausoleum is firstly because Henry lost his son, and the son was drowned, and his body wasn't recovered.
Yeah.
Therefore, there wasn't a male line to succeed him. When his line did get back in under Henry II in 1154, Henry II was the first Plantagenet king. He had significant interests in France. He was an Angevin, and he was buried in Fontevraud in the Loire Valley, as was Richard I, his son, and that developed as a royal mausoleum. And it only stopped being the royal mausoleum in 1204 when King John lost Normandy and lost the French lands, and therefore English kings couldn't be buried anymore in Normandy. King John, interestingly, was buried in Worcester, but King John's son Henry III redesigned and rebuilt Westminster Abbey, intending for that to be the new royal mausoleum, certainly where he intended to be buried, next to Edward the Confessor, and that became the royal mausoleum thereafter. So Reading sort of lost out.
Yeah.
What it got was a small number of royal infant burials.
Which is interesting itself. So, I mean, it's understandable, presumably, London was clearly emerging as the capital, the significant fortresses were there, the significant Westminster Abbey, so it's understandable in a sense that eventually the monarchs were buried there.
Yeah. Yes.
Perhaps unfortunate for Reading, but not surprising. And then if we compare also Reading with other abbeys, to say it's a run-of-the-mill sort of bog-standard abbey, it's like odd use of terminology, but can we say that it was different in other ways, or was it just particularly this royal patronage that made it unusual?
Well, Reading was one of the leading abbeys in the country. Its abbot was mitred. That means that he had a status comparable with a bishop, and he also had a seat in the House of Lords. And the abbot of Reading was one of 20. There were 25 abbeys that had mitred abbots, so therefore it was one of the top 25 abbeys. And we know from the 16th century that when at dissolution it had assets of about £2,000. So it was one of the 10 richest abbeys in the country at the dissolution. So it was an important abbey. It was a very important Benedictine house. It became a Benedictine house over time and was one of the leading Benedictine houses.
And just to interrupt there, so there's a significance about it being a Benedictine as opposed to some of the other orders. What was the point of that?
Well, they were open orders that existed within towns rather than in the country, like the Cistercians. But all of the top 25 abbeys were Benedictine. Right.
And I think that's an interesting point actually, and it's, to my mind, curious as to why then, when we explore this later, that relations deteriorated with the town, because being an open order monastery, one of the points was that they worked with the local people, they helped the sick, they educated the youth, and yet at the same time it seems that the relations were pretty grim. So I found that's a bit of a contradiction there, but that's what happened. Okay, so we have this sort of this open order monastery in the town, and then again, just so places like Winchester and Salisbury, which orders were they?
Winchester, in fact there were two abbeys at Winchester, the cathedral and another one called Hyde Abbey, which in fact was also founded by Henry I, and they were Benedictine as well. I'm not entirely... Salisbury wasn't monastic, interestingly.
Right. But again, logically, they're in the town, they're working with the people, so that makes sense as opposed to the closed orders up on the moors somewhere. Okay, and then interesting issue, which was a number of abbeys we know had sort of highly wealthy local patrons. Reading, by virtue of being a royal abbey, had the king, and that in some ways was obviously a plus, a benefit, but in some ways disbenefit, was it disadvantageous? Can you sort of explain that to us?
Yes, I think one of the very interesting things about Reading Abbey is that it was built as this wonderful Romanesque Norman edifice in the 12th century, and it remained that until the dissolution. It was not upgraded, it was not improved, it wasn't Gothicized. The only bit of additional building that we know about is the building of the Lady Chapel in the 14th century, which was an addition to the abbey and not in place of anything apart from one small apsidal chapel. And one reason why this happened, I think, or one reason why it didn't happen, rather, is that in other abbeys you tended to have local patrons, local magnates, who saw the abbey as their abbey, saw the abbey as their burial place, and during the Middle Ages they would rebuild parts of it, in particular to develop places for them to be buried and places for clergy chapels to be established to pray for their souls. And this did not happen in Reading. There was the duty of praying for the soul of Henry and his family, which took place every day, but that took place in the church that was built, and nothing was added to it. So I think that by the 16th century, Reading was in good structural condition.
Do we know that, or we think it?
We have no reason for not knowing that.
Right.
But common sense suggests that it must have been because, well, for two reasons. First of all, because we know the king and the court was coming to Reading regularly, still in the 16th century. So
yes.
it must have been good enough for the king to come to.
Yes.
And secondly, we know that when the abbey was dissolved,
yes,
the church was not destroyed.
Yeah.
It stood there. It took about 10 years for
Can we know from the records that I think that we think there's some sort of tower or spar, we're not quite sure what, was still intact. Obviously the lead and the roof were all taken off. So we know that structurally there was obviously quite a sort of complete and presumably a watertight building still.
It wasn't falling down.
So this is the interesting impact of being a royal abbey. What we're saying is that we have a Romanesque building built in the Romanesque style around about sort of early 1100s, and really that same building was pretty much the building they took down and destroyed 420 odd years later, and that makes it very unusual. Other abbeys that sort of survived in their original form throughout the period, or not?
Well, there are.
Durham is one, isn't it?
Well, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I think one of the wonderful legacies for Reading of the fact that it survived as a Romanesque building is that what is still left of it, including the capitals from the cloister in the museum collection, are wonderful pieces of Romanesque 12th century architecture, and they don't exist in many other places. So Reading is very lucky to have that legacy, albeit in a destroyed form.
Yeah.
But there are examples of other abbey churches that still exist, primarily because some of them became cathedrals at the dissolution, and Peterborough and Gloucester come immediately to mind, and both Peterborough and Gloucester both have examples of Gothic development in the years before the dissolution, in particular in the 14th and 15th centuries, Gloucester in particular. Peterborough is the best example, I think, in the country of a building that most probably looks like Reading Abbey looked like.
Okay, that's interesting. That was I wasn't aware of. So it might be interesting if we can find a picture or two of Peterborough to sort of give us some sense of what it might look like. Durham, I thought, was pretty much Romanesque and stayed as such.
Well, Durham is Romanesque in places, although it has a Cistercian end, because so its end was redeveloped in the early parts of the Gothic period.
And just to play the same idea about the disadvantage, do we have any evidence that the king either prevented local people from subscribing, contributing, benefacting the abbey, or do we know that they wanted to but were prevented from doing so?
No. I mean, contributions continued during the 12th century, but then they died off. Really, there's no evidence that the king was or the crown was stopping people from making contributions. They just seem not to be doing it, and indeed the abbey suffered a financial crisis at the end of the 13th century, and indeed it almost became bankrupt, and government officials had to be sent in to sort the finances out.
And yet we seem to think that obviously it recovered because by dissolution it was fairly affluent.
Well, not only that, the Lady Chapel was built about 50 years later. But the Lady Chapel seems to have been built through the activities of the abbey and the abbot, and not through any contribution from a third party.
But, and the problem of financial stress, did that coincide with the Black Death?
It precedes it, actually.
Right, okay. All right, so that's interesting that we've got to say this idea that in some ways, although it was well maintained, because we didn't have local benefactors, we had a building which pretty much untouched since its original construction, which made it most unusual. And it, in a sense, adds the frustration of the fact that it was destroyed, because we'd have had a superb example in this country of very early sort of Norman architecture. Yes. That's much to our loss, sadly. But we can still, I think, deduce quite a lot from what's left and what the bits we have found. And then just sort of to start to draw to conclusion, we touched on it earlier, this issue of the relationships with the town. You say a knighted abbot, and that gave him significant sort of control over the town. And in a sense, that didn't help the abbey and the abbot when it came to the end and the dissolution. So can you just explore the idea of the relations with the town?
Well, Reading is sometimes called a monastic borough. There were a number of monastic boroughs. They are where the abbot is the lord of the manor. St Albans is another, Bury, St Edmunds. And the consequence of this is that the abbot had control over the market, had control over the economy of the town, had control over the guild. And this led to tensions. And the tensions, first of all, they emerged in the middle of the 13th century. There was an attack by guilds people on the abbot's bailiff, who was collecting rents, I suspect. This ended up with the crown, and Henry III gave to recognised the guild, and he recognised the position of mayor or warden, but required the warden to be appointed by the abbot, which was a bit of an irritation to the guild. And this irritation continued throughout the centuries. In the 15th century, the guild petitioned to the king, Henry VI, to enable them to have a mace bearer, and he agreed, and the abbot then refused to allow this, and the king gave in. Later on, the guild petitioned to Henry VII to have sergeants of arms, and the king allowed this, and the abbot then refused to appoint the mayor for 4 years, and eventually the courts upheld the abbot. So even into the 16th century, this tension was carrying on. Yeah. I think you can possibly over-exaggerate it. If you look at the record of Reading compared with St Albans or Bury, for example, in St Albans and Bury there were riots against
well, at least we didn't riot in Reading. That's always a good thing to hear.
Didn't riot in Reading, no. We went to the courts instead.
Yeah.
We went to the law.
We do things properly here. Very good. Okay, well, I think our time is up. So just to go back to the original proposition, a royal abbey. And I think what John has done a super job at really opening that out and explaining why it was so unusual, so significant. And then we have all these major royal events all the way through the 1100s right through until about the 1500s. And that's significant. And it's great tragedy for us that we don't have a complete solid building here. But what we still do have clearly is the history. So much of that has come through. And it's still possible to walk round and understand and look and see the structure and see what a massive, important building it was. So John, thank you very much for that. Super. As ever, I learned a lot from that, which was great. I look forward to doing the next talk. We've got the next two lined up, hopefully, for your pleasure and interest and entertainment. Closing, let's just thank Reading Museum once again for hosting us. They've done a super job. And I think it's all seemed to been opened up for us, and masks off, and done a good job there. And then thanks to our production team, our producer and director, here's Lucy, and our sound engineer seems to have scampered off, but Sian's around, and she's been looking after us. So hopefully all this comes through clearly for you to watch and enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank
Goodbye.
You.